Get him out! He doesn't belong on this floor!
Elaine Porter's voice ripped through the 11th floor office. Caleb Monroe, the quiet black analyst everyone had learned to overlook, stood with a termination notice in his hand while Brent Calloway smiled behind the glass conference room.
Your login axed and exported restricted hospital network files.
Elaine said.
You're finished.
Caleb looked at the laptop on the table.
Did you check which device used my login?
The room went silent. Brent's smile faded for half a second. Caleb signed the paper, picked up the cardboard box beside his chair, and walked out without raising his voice. 40 minutes later, every record on the 11th floor was under legal hold. Caleb Monroe walked out of Mercer Northstar Logistics with the same cardboard box he had just carried past the silent 11th floor. The glass doors behind him whispered shut, sealing away the bright lobby, the polished floors, the security desk, and the kind of quiet laughter people release only when they believe the person leaving has no way back in. He was 38, a black man in a clean dark shirt, pressed trousers, and shoes cared for by someone who did not treat small things carelessly. The box held almost nothing: a dented steel water bottle, a wrapped phone charger, a worn black notebook, and a small photograph of his mother tucked inside the front cover. He stepped onto the stone landing outside the building and felt the late afternoon heat rising from the pavement. Behind the glass, on the 11th floor walkway that overlooked the lobby, a few faces had gathered. Some pretended they were not watching. Others did not bother to pretend. Brent Calloway leaned slightly toward a coworker, his mouth curved in a small, satisfied line. Some people just never fit a place like this, he said, not loud enough to become a formal problem, but loud enough to travel. The sentence had no forbidden word in it, no open insult anyone could put in a complaint and expect to win. That was the skill of it. It left a bruise without leaving a clean mark. Caleb heard it. His fingers tightened once around the bottom of the box, then relaxed. He did not look up. Elaine Porter stood farther back inside her glass office, arms folded, posture composed, her face carrying the calm of a manager who believed she had completed an unpleasant but necessary task. She did not smile. She did not need to. Mara Ellison sat at her desk with her eyes fixed on her screen, though her hands were still above the keyboard. Tanya Brooks stood near the row of file cabinets, one hand resting lightly against the metal edge, her expression caught between warning and apology. She looked as if she wanted to speak, but years of learning the cost of speaking had closed around her throat. Caleb saw her reflection in the glass door as he passed. He gave the smallest nod, not enough for anyone else to understand, but enough to tell her he had seen her. He had seen all of it, the quick assumptions, the careful exclusions, the missing email threads, the praise that moved upward with the wrong names attached, the corrections spoken loudly to some people and gently to others, the way suspicion found him faster than facts did. None of those things had happened loudly. That was why they had lasted. Caleb reached the bottom of the steps and set the box on the broad stone ledge beside him. He stood there for a moment under the clean corporate sign, Mercer Northstar Logistics, the letters shining above the entrance as if the building had nothing to hide. Then he took his phone from his pocket and scrolled to a contact saved under a single letter. The call connected on the second ring. Caleb's voice was low, level, and absent of any anger that could be used to misunderstand him. Preserve everything from the 11th floor. Emails, cameras, access logs, personnel files, all of it. Lock it down before anyone touches a thing. The person on the other end did not ask him to repeat himself. Caleb looked once at the glass face of the building. Somewhere inside, Brent was probably still enjoying the aftertaste of his own remark. Elaine was probably already moving on to the next meeting. Mara was probably deciding which records looked harmless enough to leave alone. They still believed the story ended with Caleb Monroe carrying a box out of the front entrance. They did not know he had spent 4 weeks learning the shape of their silence, or that Monroe was only the name he had chosen to let them see. Caleb ended the call, slipped the phone back into his pocket, picked up the cardboard box, and walked toward the parking garage without looking back. The building remained bright behind him, orderly and confident, unaware that the first quiet instruction had already begun to pull its walls open from the inside. 4 weeks before Caleb Monroe carried a cardboard box out of Mercer Northstar Logistics, he landed at Hartsfield, Jackson, with one suitcase, one worn leather bag, and no appetite for the kind of welcome his father's office had prepared for him. A driver, a Buckhead suite, and a private dinner with 3 board members had all been arranged before Caleb canceled them. He took a regular car service to Brookhaven and checked into a modest hotel under his mother's last name. For years, his work had kept him overseas, inside hospital supply networks, relief corridors, cold chain warehouses, and logistics rooms where a missed number could become a delayed shipment before anyone saw the damage coming. It was not glamorous work. No one applauded a corrected routing table. No one remembered the person who caught a bad vendor code before a rural clinic waited 3 days too long. But Caleb had learned to respect invisible systems, because invisible systems were where real failures liked to hide. His father, Arthur Mercer, had built Mercer Northstar Logistics from almost nothing, starting with a small fleet that carried medical equipment between Georgia hospitals and growing it into a company that moved medicine, surgical supplies, emergency generators, and time-sensitive freight across the South. Arthur was 68 now, still broad-shouldered, still direct, but slower in the way men become when they have carried responsibility for decades and only recently admitted its weight. He met Caleb the next morning in a quiet conference room on the 34th floor, long before most executives arrived. No assistants, no board members, no announcement, just 2 cups of coffee cooling between them and the city turning pale beyond the glass. Arthur did not begin with sentiment. He rarely did. He slid a folder across the table, not toward Caleb exactly, but into the space between them, as if the company itself belonged there. The succession plan was inside. The board had approved it. The legal path was clear. The public announcement could happen within weeks. Caleb opened the folder, read only the first page, then closed it. "Not yet," he said. Arthur looked at him for a long moment. He did not seem surprised. Caleb said he could not lead a company he had only seen from polished floors and prepared numbers. He did not want a tour. He did not want department heads explaining what they thought he wanted to hear. He wanted a badge, a desk, a supervisor who did not know his name, and a month inside the part of the company that handled the work nobody praised until it failed. Arthur listened without interrupting. Outside the glass, the building below them was beginning to fill. People were entering through the lobby in streams, carrying coffee, laptops, private worries, and the practiced expressions of office life. Arthur finally nodded toward the lower floors. "The 11th," he said. Caleb had already chosen it. The 11th floor handled supplier data, delivery reports, contract histories, process evaluations, and performance records for operations teams across several states. It was not the most powerful floor in the building, but it was close enough to daily pressure to reveal the truth. Caleb had seen this before in other organizations. A company did not first rot in the chairman's office. It softened in the middle, where managers had enough authority to shape people's lives and enough distance from executives to avoid careful attention. Arthur agreed to the arrangement with conditions: no special access during the first month, no executive elevator, no introduction, no one outside legal, and the chairman's office would know. Caleb would use Monroe, his mother's name, because Mercer would open doors before anyone decided whether he deserved them. The title would be Temporary Operations Data Associate. The pay would match the role. The badge would look like every other badge. Caleb accepted all of it. Before he left the room, Arthur walked to the window and stood with his hands behind his back. For the first time that morning, his voice carried something quieter than authority. "Don't only watch how they treat power," he said. "Watch how they treat someone they think has none." Caleb held that sentence longer than he expected. It was not advice about corporate politics. It was a warning about human nature. That afternoon, HR processed Caleb Monroe as a temporary hire for the 11th floor. No one in the system paused over the name. No one saw Mercer hidden behind it. By Monday morning, Caleb would walk through the front entrance like any other employee trying to prove he belonged. That was exactly what he wanted. He believed the company would show him its truth slowly. He did not yet know how quickly some people would decide he was the kind of man they did not need to respect. Caleb arrived at Mercer Northstar before 8 on his first morning, not early enough to look eager, and not late enough to give anyone a reason to remember him poorly. He stood for a second outside the glass entrance, watching employees pass through the lobby with the practiced confidence of people who knew where they were expected to go. He wore a clean gray button-down, dark trousers, and the same leather bag he had carried through airports, warehouses, and hospital corridors on 3 continents. There was nothing careless about him, but nothing about him suggested money, title, or executive access. He looked, by design, like a man who had come to work and hoped the work would speak clearly enough. The receptionist looked up when he approached the desk, and her eyes moved over him a little too slowly before her professional smile arrived. "Delivery entrance is around the side," she said. Then, as if correcting herself without wanting to admit the correction, she added, "Or are you here for building maintenance?" Caleb took out the printed onboarding email and placed it on the counter without hurry. "Caleb Monroe," he said, "New Operations Data Associate, 11th floor." The receptionist glanced at the email, then at her screen, then back at him. A small flush rose along her neck. "Of course," she said quickly. "Sorry about that. First day badge." Her fingers moved across the keyboard faster than necessary. Caleb did not make her discomfort larger. He simply waited, because he had learned years ago that moments like this were rarely about one person alone. They were habits wearing a company logo. At security, the guard held Caleb's temporary badge longer than he had held the badge of the man before him. He turned it once, checked the screen, looked at Caleb's face, then checked the screen again. A white employee behind Caleb scanned in and passed through with a soft beep and no pause at all. No one said anything. No one needed to. Caleb accepted the badge when it was finally handed back and stepped toward the elevators with the same calm expression he had worn at the desk. Inside the elevator, he watched the numbers climb and let the first notes form in his mind. Not conclusions, not accusations, just observations. The 11th floor opened into a wide office divided by glass walls, low partitions, and a quiet hum of printers and keyboards. Elaine Porter met him near the reception alcove. She was 46, trim, composed, and dressed in a cream blazer that made her look more welcoming than she sounded. Her smile was precise, the kind that completed its task and disappeared. "Caleb Monroe," she said, reading his name from the folder as if the folder were more reliable than the man in front of her. "Temporary Operations Data Associate." "That's right," Caleb said. Elaine led him past the central cluster of desks, where several employees looked up and then looked away with office-trained timing. She stopped at a small workstation near the printers, not quite hidden, but clearly outside the main current of conversation. "You'll start here." On the desk was a thick stack of supplier reports with colored flags sticking out at uneven angles. "This is overdue," Elaine said. "Vendor reconciliation, missing tags, inconsistent formatting. It may be a little complex at first, but do what you can." She said it softly enough that anyone passing by would have heard encouragement. Caleb heard the assumption underneath it. She had not asked about his background. She had not seen him analyze a single file. Yet she had already placed a ceiling over him and called it patience. "I'll review it," he said. Brent Calloway appeared from behind a row of monitors carrying coffee and confidence in equal measure. He was 41, broad in the shoulders, loud in the casual way of people who know the room will forgive them. "New guy?" he asked Elaine, then turned to Caleb before she answered. "How's it going, big guy?" The words landed lightly, almost friendly, but Caleb noticed the difference immediately. A minute later, Brent called another employee, Daniel, and a third Ms. Grant, with easy accuracy. With Caleb, he had chosen a nickname before earning the right to use his name. Mara Ellison sat 2 desks away, her attention fixed on a document Caleb could not yet see. She gave him one brief glance, not cold exactly, but assessing, then returned to her screen. Elaine mentioned that Mara handled internal summaries, attribution notes, meeting recaps, and performance documentation for the team. Caleb filed that away. In offices like this, power did not always sit where the loudest voice sat. Sometimes it lived with the person who decided whose name made it into the record. By 9:15, Caleb was alone at the small desk near the printer, opening the overdue reports Elaine had given him. The data was messy but not difficult. Duplicate supplier IDs, broken source tags, a few departments using old codes no one had bothered to retire. He began cleaning the files in silence, while conversations moved around him without including him. Twice, someone came to the printer and glanced at his screen as if checking whether he was doing what he had been told. Caleb kept working. He did not argue with the receptionist. He did not challenge the guard. He did not correct Brent in front of Elaine. The first day was not for proving, it was for seeing. And by noon, Caleb understood something his father's reports had never said. Mercer Northstar did not always need a raised voice to tell a man where it thought he belonged. By the end of his first week, Caleb understood that the 11th floor was not disorganized. It only looked casual from a distance. Under the small talk, the ringing desk phones, the shared calendars, and the soft clicking of keyboards, there was a structure everyone had learned to obey. Elaine Porter sat at the center of it, without ever needing to announce herself as the center. Her office had glass walls, but the glass did not make her transparent. It made her visible, which was more useful. People could tell when she was watching, when she was displeased, and when a half-closed office door was meant to become a lesson. Brent Calloway moved around that system like a man who had been rewarded too many times for mistaking volume for leadership. He joked before meetings, during meetings, after meetings, and almost every joke carried a small blade wrapped in laughter. If someone smiled, he owned the room. If someone did not, he could lean back and say he was only having fun. Mara Ellison rarely laughed. She did not need to. She handled the meeting summaries, project notes, attribution lines, and internal follow-ups with the quiet precision of someone who understood that history belonged to whoever wrote the record. Caleb watched names appear and disappear from emails with a smoothness that would have seemed accidental if it had not happened so often. He watched people change their sentences when Elaine walked by. He watched employees lower their voices before saying anything that sounded like concern. The rest of the floor had the habits of people who had adapted to weather they could not change. They knew when to laugh at Brent's remarks, when to stare at their screens, and which questions had to wait until the hallway was empty. No one explained these rules to Caleb. No one had to. On Thursday afternoon, he saw the rules work against Tanya Brooks. Tanya was 34, careful in her work, and calm in the way people become when they have learned not to spend emotion where it will not be protected. She'd been reviewing a dashboard for regional delivery performance when Elaine stopped behind her chair. The chart on Tanya's screen had one label misaligned, a formatting issue so small Caleb would have corrected it in 10 seconds and moved on. Elaine did not move on. She placed one hand on the back of Tanya's chair and said, loud enough for the surrounding desks to hear, that presentation standards mattered because leadership could not trust numbers that looked careless. The room quieted in pieces, first the desk nearest Tanya, then the next, then the whole row. Tanya's face did not change much, only her jaw tightened, then released. I'll correct it, she said. She did not explain that the numbers were right. She did not say the label had shifted when the file converted. She did not look around for support, because looking for support in that room would only show everyone how little was available. Caleb kept his eyes on his screen, but he saw enough. There was a sadness in Tanya's stillness that had nothing to do with the chart. It was the stillness of someone who had learned that defending herself could be rewritten as attitude, and even accuracy needed permission to survive. 20 minutes later, Brent sent a routing estimate to the wrong regional folder, delaying a vendor confirmation that mattered far more than Tanya's crooked label. Elaine noticed. Caleb saw her read the message, pause, and walk to Brent's desk. Her voice dropped into something almost warm. Let's clean that up before it grows, she said. You're working through a lot of pressure this week. Brent nodded, grateful but not embarrassed. No silence fell over the room. No one treated the mistake as proof of anything larger. It was simply a mistake, softened by context, protected by familiarity. Caleb looked from Brent's desk to Tanya's screen, and understood the shape of the place more clearly. The 11th floor did not only punish errors or reward performance. It decided whose mistakes were forgiven, whose mistakes became identity, and whose work was allowed to be seen. Caleb wrote nothing down then. He did not need to. Some patterns entered the mind cleanly and stayed there. By Friday evening, he understood that Elaine's floor was held together not by loyalty but by calculation. People were not silent because they agreed. They were silent because they had learned the cost of becoming visible. By the second Monday, Elaine Porter had decided Caleb Monroe was useful, but only in the way a locked supply closet was useful. Something to open when there was a mess no one else wanted to touch. She stopped by his desk a little after 10, set a thick folder beside his keyboard, and said the regional medical supply routing report needed to be cleaned before leadership reviewed it the next morning. Her tone made the assignment sound simple. The folder said otherwise. The report covered 9 hospitals across the Southeast, including smaller facilities that depended on Mercer Northstar's timing more than anyone in the room liked to admit. It was already 5 days late. Vendor codes had been entered under 3 different systems. Priority markers were missing or duplicated. 3 rural routes had been labeled routine, even though the attached order numbers showed emergency equipment. Caleb opened the files and felt the kind of quiet focus settle over him that had carried him through harder rooms than this one. Messy data did not offend him, careless systems did. By noon, he had separated old vendor codes from active ones. By 3, he had found duplicate line items that made the delivery projections look more stable than they were. By 6, most of the floor had emptied. Elaine passed his desk with her purse over one arm and paused just long enough to say, "Don't overcomplicate it." Caleb looked at the open spreadsheet, where 3 mislabeled rural routes could have delayed emergency shipments to 3 smaller hospitals if the storm schedule shifted the wrong way. "I won't," he said. She left without asking what he had found. That told him something. Brent Calloway left 15 minutes later, laughing into his phone. Mara Ellison stayed until nearly 8, her screen angled away from the walkway, her hands moving steadily through a document Caleb could not see. At 12:40 a.m., Caleb uploaded the finished report to the shared drive. He had rebuilt the tracking table, corrected the supplier codes, added source notes, flagged the 3 vulnerable routes, and created a priority warning tab that made the risk impossible to miss. The final version carried his name in the edit history. He saved a copy to his personal work folder because clean work deserved a clean trail. The next morning, the conference room was full before 9. Regional leadership had dialed in on the screen. Elaine sat near the head of the table. Brent stood at the front with a clicker in his hand, smiling like a man about to reveal something he had earned. Caleb took a seat near the back wall. He opened the agenda and saw the title slide. Brent Calloway, Lead Analysis. Mara Ellison, Data Standardization. Caleb Monroe, Entry Support. For one brief second, something settled inside Caleb with a clarity that did not need anger. Brent moved through the slides confidently. "My team found the routing issue late last night," he said, tapping the screen where Caleb's priority warning tab had been turned into a polished graphic. "We caught 3 vulnerable hospital routes before weather disruptions could make them a problem." Elaine nodded with visible approval. "This is what leadership under pressure looks like," she said. Brent accepted the praise without the smallest sign of discomfort. Mara glanced down at her notes, expression smooth, as if her version of the record had always been the only version. Caleb sat with his hands folded on the table and said nothing. Interrupting would have made him look emotional. Correcting Brent in that room would have turned the theft into a debate about tone. So he watched. He watched Elaine praise a man for work she knew Caleb had done. He watched Mara avoid looking toward the back of the room. He watched 2 regional managers on the screen thank Brent for his urgency. Then he looked at the slide again and understood that his name had not been accidentally pushed downward. It had been placed there. After the meeting, people drifted out in small groups, carrying laptops and praise that had already attached itself to the wrong person. Caleb returned to his desk and opened the shared drive. The metadata still showed his upload time. The earlier draft still carried his source notes. The version history had not yet been cleaned. He saved screenshots quietly. A few minutes later, Tanya Brooks walked past his desk without stopping. Her face gave away nothing. Her hand moved once, quick and controlled, leaving a folded slip of paper beside his keyboard. Caleb waited until she was gone before opening it. "Keep your originals." He read the words once, then again. They were not advice from someone guessing. They were instruction from someone who had survived the pattern long enough to name it without saying it aloud. Caleb looked across the floor. Brent was laughing near Elaine's office. Mara was typing into the meeting recap. Tanya sat at her desk, eyes on her screen, shoulders still. And for the first time, the theft of his work no longer felt like an isolated insult. It felt like a door opening onto a hallway that had been there for years. After the routing report, Elaine Porter began watching Caleb Monroe differently. Not with respect, and not with curiosity, but with the measured attention of someone whose first judgment had been challenged and who did not appreciate the inconvenience. She did not say he had done good work. She did not ask how he had found the priority error. She did not mention the 3 hospital routes he had protected from delay. Instead, her assignments changed shape. They arrived later in the day, carried less context, and came wrapped in language clean enough to look reasonable if anyone ever reviewed it. On Wednesday at 4:45, just as the floor was beginning its slow shift toward evening, Elaine forwarded Caleb a dataset with missing source fields and a subject line that read, "Preliminary review needed by morning." The message contained one sentence. "Please provide a clear recommendation before 9:00. Caleb opened the file and saw the problem immediately. Half the vendor status notes had been removed. Several shipment categories were undefined. 2 columns had been renamed without any reference key. He walked to Elaine's office and asked whether there was a source document attached to the file. Elaine looked up from her screen with a patient expression that made patience feel like an accusation. "Use your judgment," she said. Caleb held her gaze for a second, long enough to understand that the answer was the trap. If he wrote cautiously, she could call him uncertain. If he pushed harder, she could say he had gone beyond the data. The task only had to give her a handle. He returned to his desk and worked until the office lights looked too white against the dark windows. The next morning, in the team meeting, Elaine reviewed his memo with a red pen in her hand, though everyone was looking at the shared screen. "This is careful," she said, pausing on the word as if it were not a compliment. But leadership sometimes requires more confidence. 2 days later, after Caleb submitted a stronger recommendation on a different file, she leaned back and said, "We have to be careful not to overstate what the data can support." No one in the room reacted. That was part of the design. The contradiction did not need to be hidden if everyone had been trained not to name it. Mara Ellison's role became harder to miss. Caleb would arrive at a meeting and hear references to updates he had never received. When he checked the email chain, his name would be missing. Mara always responded with the same small apology. Must have been an oversight. The first time, it could have been. The second time, it became careless. By the fourth, Caleb knew it was neither. Elaine began asking questions in front of the group. "Caleb, are you caught up on the revised vendor thresholds?" He would answer evenly that he had not been included on the revision email. Mara would lower her eyes, type something, and say, "Adding you now." The room would move on, but the impression had already been placed where Elaine wanted it. Caleb was behind. Caleb was not keeping up. Caleb needed managing. Brent Calloway added his own layer, lighter on the surface and uglier underneath. He stopped by Caleb's desk one afternoon while 2 analysts were waiting for printed packets and said, "You know, Monroe, you look like you could run the whole loading bay by yourself." He laughed before anyone else could decide whether it was funny. A few people joined in with the thin, uncomfortable sound of people protecting themselves. Caleb looked at him calmly. "I run models," he said. Brent lifted both hands, still smiling. "Relax." Compliment. The word hung there, dishonest and useful. Later that week, a hospital network delegation came in for a review meeting. Caleb stood near the screen with the dashboard he had built, preparing to walk them through delayed route forecasting. One of the visitors glanced at him and asked whether he could help connect the display cable. Elaine heard it. She could have corrected it immediately. She could have said Caleb built the model they were about to review. Instead, she let the pause stretch just long enough for the room to feel it. Caleb reached beside the monitor, checked the cable, then turned back to the group. "The display is ready," he said. "I'm Caleb Monroe. I built the forecasting model we'll be reviewing." The visitor apologized quickly, but the apology was not the part Caleb remembered. He remembered Elaine's silence. After the meeting, he found Tanya Brooks at the coffee station, waiting while the machine filled a paper cup she did not seem to want. She did not look at him when she spoke. "It's not one comment," she said. "That's what people miss." Caleb stood beside her, the hum of the machine filling the space between them. Tanya's voice stayed low. "It's proving every day that you belong in a room where other people are assumed to belong before they open their mouths." Caleb did not answer right away. He only nodded. By then, the 11th floor had become clear to him in a way no report could have made it. Its problem was not only bad management. It was a practiced way of seeing people, deciding who looked like authority, who looked like assistants, who deserved patience, and who had to earn basic belief one careful sentence at a time. On the third Friday morning, Caleb began searching the archived project folders for a missing delivery benchmark tied to the Southeast routing model. The file path took him deeper than he expected, past current vendor reports and into older emergency order analyses that had not been opened in months. Most employees treated old folders like storage rooms, useful only when something had gone wrong. Caleb treated them differently. Old records had a way of telling the truth after the people who wrote them had forgotten what they were trying to hide. He found the report just after 11, buried under a neutral title that made it sound less important than it was. Regional Response Improvement, Prior Cycle. The final version listed Brent Calloway as the lead contributor, Mara Ellison as documentation support, and Tanya Brooks as analysis assistants. Caleb almost moved on. Then he opened the version history. The first draft had been created 2 years earlier by Tanya. Not edited, created. Her name appeared on the original model, the first route map, the first emergency priority adjustment, and the formula that reduced processing time across several high-pressure deliveries. Caleb leaned back slightly, his eyes staying on the screen. The improvement was not small. The model had cut emergency routing delays by nearly 10%, not through luck, but through careful pattern recognition. Tanya had seen where the old system slowed down and had built a cleaner path through it. In the final version, her work had been polished, renamed, and moved under Brent's leadership summary. It was the same pattern as Caleb's stolen report, only older and cleaner. He opened Tanya's performance review from that year. The language was professional enough to pass through any HR system without raising a hand. Not ready for leadership. Needs stronger executive presence. Valuable contributor but not yet positioned for strategic ownership. Caleb read the phrases twice. They were soft words with hard edges. No one had to say Tanya lacked intelligence. No one had to write that they did not want to see her standing at the front of a room. They only had to describe leadership in a way she could never quite satisfy. The door would stay closed, and the record would look polite. Caleb did not ask Tanya about it immediately. He checked 2 more archived projects first. In one, her data corrections appeared in the draft, but vanished from the final attribution. In another, a risk memo she had written was summarized by Brent in a leadership update. Mara's name sat quietly in both records, not as the creator of the work, but as the person who made the final version look official. By mid-afternoon, Caleb understood that Tanya's warning, "Keep your originals," had not been a kindness offered from instinct. It had been a rule learned through loss. He found her later near the file cabinets, sorting printed vendor forms with a stillness that no longer looked passive to him. "The emergency response model from 2 years ago," he said quietly. "That was yours." Tanya's fingers paused on the edge of a folder. She did not turn right away. When she finally looked at him, her face carried a tired caution, as if the truth itself might be another trap. "It started as mine," she said. Caleb waited. Tanya glanced toward Elaine's office, then lowered her voice. I built the first model. Brent presented it. Elaine said leadership needed one voice in the room. When I asked why the attribution changed, she told me to focus on being a team player. There was no bitterness in her voice, which made it heavier, like something she had folded and carried for years, because there had been nowhere safe to put it down. Caleb asked if she had ever filed a concern. Tanya gave a small smile without warmth. Informally. It came back to Elaine. That answer told him more than a paragraph could have. Across the floor, Mara looked up from her screen and saw them speaking. She looked away too quickly. Within half an hour, Elaine called Mara into her office. Brent joined them 5 minutes later. The blinds did not close, but their voices dropped. Caleb returned to his desk and saved copies of the metadata, the draft history, and the performance language. He did not know exactly what they had noticed, only that they had noticed. By the end of the day, he could feel the floor shifting around him. Elaine's smile became thinner. Mara's emails became shorter. Brent's jokes stopped landing near him and began circling behind him. Caleb had crossed an invisible line. He was no longer only a man they underestimated. He was a man who had started looking in places they had counted on staying closed. By the 4th week, Elaine Porter no longer treated Caleb Monroe like a temporary inconvenience. She treated him like a problem that had begun to understand the room. On Monday morning, she stopped beside his desk with a folder pressed flat against her palm and the pleasant, careful expression she used when she wanted a decision to look ordinary. "You'll support the audit framework for the Calhoun Rural Network contract," she said. $85 million in medical equipment distribution. Sensitive data, tight review, very little room for mistakes. Brent Calloway glanced over from 2 desks away as if he had been waiting for the sentence. Mara Ellison did not look up, but her typing slowed. Elaine placed the folder on Caleb's desk. "This should give you a chance to work on something more serious than spreadsheets." The words were light enough to pass as encouragement. Caleb heard the old ceiling inside them. He opened the folder and saw the scope immediately. Hospital delivery windows, supplier compliance notes, rural route capacity, equipment priority tiers, and restricted vendor data tied to facilities that could not afford delays. If he refused, he was not ready. If he accepted and anything went wrong, the stakes were high enough to remove him cleanly. Caleb accepted. He built the audit tracker from scratch, marked restricted fields, separated editable sections from locked references, and assigned access according to policy. Elaine received oversight rights. Brent received review access. Mara received documentation access. Every permission was logged, every update timestamped, every source file attached to a clean version trail. Caleb did not announce any of this. Careful work did not need a speech. By late afternoon, Mara had already found the opening, a temporary audit admin reset token created during the setup process, the kind that should have expired but had not been disabled. Because Caleb's credentials touched every part of the framework he had built, that forgotten token gave them a way to create a session under his name without ever needing his password. That alone made the accusation useful. In Elaine's office, Mara stood with a slim folder against her chest, while Brent leaned near the glass wall, speaking softly for once. Caleb could not hear the words, but he saw Elaine's face change from irritation to consideration. She did not look shocked. She looked as if a door had been offered. That evening, after most of the floor had emptied, the audit system recorded activity that would later be described as Caleb's. A restricted data pull appeared under his account, while the real activity passed through Brent's workstation. Mara altered the audit note attached to the session, making the sequence look simple to anyone who checked only the account name. Brent's workstation stayed lit longer than usual. Mara remained at her desk with her screen angled away from the aisle. Elaine left without looking toward Caleb's empty chair. The next morning, Caleb arrived at 8:10, set his leather bag beside the desk, and had not yet opened his laptop when Colin Reeves from HR appeared near the printer. Colin was 44, neatly dressed, tired around the eyes, and carrying the kind of folder no one brought to a casual conversation. "Caleb," he said, "can you step into conference room B?" Elaine was already inside. A thin file sat on the table. Brent stood outside the room, not pretending hard enough to be elsewhere. Mara was absent, but her technical summary lay on top of the folder. Colin cleared his throat and said Caleb's account had accessed and exported restricted data within the last 34 hours. Elaine looked at him with a disappointment so prepared it felt rehearsed. "I wish I could say I'm surprised," she said. Caleb felt the sentence land, not as evidence, but as permission for everyone else in the room to believe the worst quickly. He asked whether they had verified the originating device. Colin's eyes moved to Elaine. Elaine said the supporting materials had been packaged for legal review and were not available to him at this stage. Caleb asked whether there was an appeal process. Colin said the contract involved sensitive medical distribution data, and the termination was immediate. He had accepted the summary in front of him as complete, and that mistake would follow him upstairs before the day was over. The room was quiet because everyone knew the decision had been made before Caleb entered. He read the termination notice, line by line, signed acknowledgement of receipt, and asked for a copy. Colin gave it to him without meeting his eyes. Caleb returned to his desk while the 11th floor went still in fragments. Conversations stopped, then restarted too softly. Tanya Brooks stood near the file cabinets, both hands resting on the metal edge, her face tight with something she could not safely release. Caleb placed his steel water bottle, phone charger, black notebook, and the photograph of his mother into a cardboard box. He did not rush. He did not give Elaine the raised voice she could file away as confirmation. As he passed the central aisle, Brent said under his breath, "Guess the system worked." Caleb paused for half a second, just long enough to hear both meanings. The data system had supposedly caught him. The other system, older and uglier, believed it had finally pushed him out. Caleb gave Tanya one small nod and walked toward the elevator. The moment the story began with had finally arrived in full. He set the box on the ledge, took out his phone, and called Helena Price, Mercer Northstar's general counsel, saved in his contacts under a single letter. Helena answered on the second ring. Caleb did not raise his voice. Lock down every record on the 11th floor. No one deletes a thing. He gave the instructions in clean order, and Helena issued the legal hold under her authority as general counsel. 5 years of emails, access logs, hallway cameras, personnel files, project attribution records, performance reviews, promotion notes, and every data change tied to the audit system. He told her to keep his identity sealed until Arthur Mercer chose the moment. Then he ended the call, carried the box to the garage, and sat in his car for 8 minutes without starting the engine. Anger would have been easier. Anger would have given the morning a shape small enough to hold. But Caleb was not angry in that simple way. He was arranging the pieces, the receptionist's first assumption, the guard's extra pause, Elaine's soft ceilings disguised as patience, Mara's missing email chains, Brent's jokes, Tanya's folded warning, the old project files, the false data trail. None of it was separate anymore. The month-long test had ended the moment they fabricated a breach. 40 minutes later, Caleb returned through the private elevator from the lower parking level and rode to the 34th floor. Arthur Mercer was already in the boardroom, standing rather than sitting, his hands resting on the back of a chair. Helena had 2 legal analysts with her. Colin Reeves sat near the far end of the table, pale with the stunned expression of a man who had just discovered that the employee he had terminated belonged in a room he had never been invited to question. Caleb did not humiliate him. He placed the termination notice on the table and asked 3 questions. Who handed you the file? What did HR verify before acting? Why was a serious data accusation processed without confirming the originating device? Colin swallowed before answering. Elaine had supplied the summary. Mara had attached the technical notes. HR had reviewed the account activity, not the machine source. Helena's team was already inside the system by then. Within 20 minutes, the first fracture appeared. The restricted data had been accessed under Caleb's credentials, but not from Caleb's workstation. The internal address matched Brent Calloway's terminal. A permissions adjustment made before the export traced back to an administrative profile Mara Ellison used for documentation controls. Arthur listened without interrupting, but the lines around his mouth tightened with each finding. By early afternoon, the legal hold was confirmed, The records were sealed, and a company-wide notice went out. Mandatory gathering in the main atrium at 3:30 for an announcement regarding leadership transition. On the 11th floor, speculation moved faster than work. Elaine stood near the window bank, calm enough to look confident. Brent told someone the company needed steady hands after a security scare. Mara stayed at her desk, quieter than usual, touching her phone as though it might still give her something to fix. At 3:30, the atrium filled shoulder to shoulder. Arthur Mercer walked onto the platform and waited until the room settled. He spoke about the company's future, but not in the polished language people expected. He said the next leader of Mercer Northstar had spent nearly a month inside the building, not to study profit reports, but to see how the company treated someone it believed had no power. Then Arthur turned toward the side entrance and said, "Caleb Monroe Mercer." Caleb walked onto the platform in the same shirt he had worn when Elaine fired him that morning. The silence was immediate and complete. Elaine's face emptied first, then tightened. Brent stopped moving. Mara looked down at her phone, but the records had already been sealed beyond her reach. In the back of the crowd, Tanya Brooks stood very still, her eyes bright with recognition and restraint. Caleb did not smile. He did not point anyone out. He looked across the atrium and said that what happened to him was not an isolated misunderstanding. It was a sign of a system that had become too comfortable deciding who deserved patience, who deserved belief, and who could be made invisible. A company does not become fair because it has a policy, he said. It becomes fair when people with power stop pretending they cannot see. Helena stepped forward after him and stated that the accusation against Caleb was false, that preliminary evidence indicated the incident had been created, and that the investigation would expand to 5 years of 11th floor records. Elaine, Brent, Mara, and several others were placed on administrative suspension, effective immediately. Around the atrium, some employees lowered their eyes, not because they had built the system, but because they had learned to survive by letting it stand. The silence after Arthur's announcement was no longer confusion. It was recognition. Caleb did not fire them from the stage. He wanted the whole truth first. The investigation did not end in the heat of the atrium, and Caleb Monroe Mercer made sure it did not become a performance. For the next several days, the 34th floor stayed lit long after most of Mercer Northstar had gone dark. Helena Price's legal team moved through the 11th floor records carefully, knowing another careless conclusion could become another injustice. They read emails, access logs, revision histories, project summaries, promotion notes, and reviews that looked harmless until placed side by side. When the pattern finally emerged, it was not dramatic in the way people expected. It was worse because it was ordinary. 5 years, at least 14 employees had received evaluations that shifted sharply after they questioned credit, workload, or treatment. 5 had been passed over for advancement, despite stronger records than the people selected above them. 3 had left after raising concerns that never traveled beyond the managers the complaints were about. Several project summaries had been rewritten so that the work of quieter employees moved upward under names Elaine trusted. Brent Calloway appeared more than 30 times in favorable reports where his documented contribution was thin or late. Mara Ellison had not simply typed meeting notes. She had adjusted attribution, softened evidence, reordered names, and made the final record look clean enough for leadership to approve without seeing the hands underneath. Elaine Porter's name appeared again and again as the approving authority, sometimes directly, sometimes through silence disguised as oversight. Colin Reeves was reviewed separately. Caleb did not treat failure and malice as the same thing, but he did not let failure hide behind good intentions either. In a closed meeting, Caleb told Colin that HR could not call itself neutral when the process kept returning injured employees to the people who had injured them. Colin sat very still, his face drawn, and for once he did not reach for policy language. He only nodded, as if the words had found a place his defenses could not cover. When the evidence was complete, Caleb spent 1 more hour with the files before making the decisions quietly. Elaine, Brent, Mara, and 5 others whose participation was clearly documented were terminated. Each notice named the conduct plainly: fabricated data claims, manipulated reviews, retaliation against concerns, misattributed work, and the creation of an unfair environment. There was no public humiliation, no staged walkout, no speech meant to entertain the building. Accountability did not need applause. Afterward, Caleb asked Tanya Brooks to meet him in a smaller conference room away from the executive floor. She arrived with a notebook held against her chest, prepared for caution because caution had protected her longer than trust ever had. Caleb did not tell her she was brave for enduring what the company should have stopped. He did not make her a symbol. He opened the file, showed her the restored attribution on the emergency routing model, and said, "Mercer Northstar took credit from you and then used the missing credit to deny you a future. I'm sorry." Tanya looked down at the page for a long time. The expression that crossed her face was not victory. It was grief finally given permission to stand upright. Her promotion file was reopened, and after an independent review confirmed what the record had hidden, she was offered the lead analyst role for medical transport strategy, not as a gesture, but as a correction. Former employees were contacted by independent counsel, not with cold form letters, but with direct apologies, a process for review, compensation where the record supported it, and the choice to speak with the company again only if they wanted to. A reporting channel was created outside the management chain. Every 11th floor evaluation from the past 5 years was placed under review. Managers across the company were required to complete new training on bias, responsibility, and the difference between order and fairness. Weeks later, after the building had emptied, and the city lights reflected in the dark office glass, Caleb went down to the parking garage and brought up the cardboard box he had once carried out through the front entrance. He placed the steel water bottle on the windowsill, plugged the charger into his desk, set his mother's photograph beside the monitor, and opened the black notebook. On the first clean page, he wrote, "Power means nothing if it only protects itself." Arthur Mercer stood in the doorway and said nothing. He understood that his son had not merely won back a room. He had begun repairing the rooms Arthur had stopped seeing. Caleb closed the notebook and looked over the quiet city, knowing the real work would be slower, but more honest. A decent workplace was not built by slogans on walls. It was built in the daily choice to see people clearly before judging where they belonged. If Caleb's silence, Tanya's warning, or that final reveal stayed with you, like and subscribe for more stories like this. What moment hit you the hardest, and where are you watching from today? Share it in the comments.